This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds, 5 weeks and counting to the election. I want to call this the decline of empire. And I want to drive home the point that the symptoms are now accumulating. It's no longer this or that crisis that capitalism as a system has shown itself quite resilient in overcoming. Let's remember that capitalism as a system was the core problem in World Wars I and II, the worst wars the history of the human race has ever seen, fought over the division and redivision of the world for the benefit of capitalist corporations driving their respective governments. Back around World War I, people understood that and talked about it explicitly. In World War II, it was fudgier, harder to see, because it was overlaid with ideologies about fascism and democracy and so on. But it was capitalist countries going to war with one another, fighting out who would win, who would lose, who would gain. But the system came back after World War I. It limped, but it came back. And after World War II, it came back with a roar. That's what the last 50 years were about, the recovery from World War II and the ability to fly a little bit in the aftermath of that horrific destruction. But now there are too many issues, too many problems crowding in on one another. Let me try to make the case. The failure, particularly in the United States, Britain, and a number of other old capitalist countries, the failure to prepare adequately for COVID, the failure to contain this, the failure of the private capitalist sector to work together with the government to solve these problems properly, that's a sign of deep dysfunction. If you found that kind of failure in the human body, you would speak of disease. There was no excuse. We know what viruses are. They've been with the human race from the beginning. We know how devastating they can be. We had one in 1918. We know we have to be prepared with the masks and the gloves and the hospital units and the trained people, etc., etc. Private companies that can make all of that stuff didn't do it. Private companies that could have stored all of that production in warehouses located around the country to take care of our needs, they didn't do it. The government of this country that knows exactly that private companies seeking profit won't do what's necessary for public health could have and should have stepped in to compensate for the failure of private capitalism to secure public health. But a government ideologically trapped in the crazy idea that private profit-driven capitalism solves all our social problems, that kind of a government didn't act. Especially when it's led by people who have drunk that Kool-Aid, like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson. And so we have the devastation and the death. But again, that's just one failure. We have many more. The fires that decimate the West Coast. The fact that we have a racial divide in this country that has been a fundamental festering problem for centuries that keeps not being solved. Just like the people of Louisville on that grand jury could not figure out what they needed to do. They want to kick the problem down the road. If you systematically and abusively discriminate against a part of your population, you will either have chaos as those folks fight against their suffering, or you will need a repressive military police force to control the situation. And that is really bad either way. We know all of that. No one needs me to repeat it, except as part of a more general collapse. And then we see a government falling apart, unable to function, provoking more and more division and bitterness with each passing day. You can't blame all of that on Mr. Trump. This is a product of a system that's not working anymore. We now have a real competitor, not just militarily with nuclear weapons, but on the ground economically, in producing goods and services that consumers need, that businesses need. I'm talking about the People's Republic of China and more other countries that are stepping up to become competitors as well. India, Brazil, and I could go on. They're squeezing the American economy, forcing business after business to make the decision to not grow in the United States because the opportunities for profit, and we live in a profit-driven system, are better in China and India and Brazil. Workers cost less, and the market is growing faster than in the United States. And that's a double whammy that American business dare not ignore. And so, yes, the politicians can prattle on about bringing jobs back to the United States. It's not happening. On redesigning global supply lines, not happening either. There's been terrible tension between the U.S. and China, and in particularly in Hong Kong. And yet all the statistics indicate that American companies in China are staying there, and American and foreign companies in Hong Kong, they're staying there too. Why should they leave? It would undermine their bottom line. If there is a civil war in the United States, it will be the end of the American empire. The last civil war we had in the 19th century remains to this day, the most devastating, destructive war in this country's history, and the United States has participated in many wars. Division, fighting inside, another symptom of a declining empire. An empire that can't rip off the rest of the world, that isn't the top dog anymore, that can't solve its problems at home by dishing out bits and pieces of what it is taking from the rest of the world. Now the rest of the world won't let us. Now the rest of the world is eating our lunch. And now the fight begins inside the United States as to who's going to take it on the chin as the empire shrinks. And it's not a pretty picture of division and struggle. Are we really going to allow this country to begin to look like those other countries we always looked at with awe? You know, those places where there are a few rich cities where people play and buy and shop while surrounded by a vast population of desperately poor people. You know, that's a hard thing to sustain if you've been that way for centuries. But is it even possible after a century, the 20th, when the United States convinced itself and the world that it was something new and different, that in it there was a vast middle class that would be taken care of? Can you force that genie back into the bottle? Can you force the American people to become a place where there's a vast sea of poverty punctuated by a few cities of wealth? Wow. Are these things possible? I don't think so. I think we're in the beginnings of a period of serious economic decline, and that the symptoms mounting around us are all symptoms of that decline. And the gut feeling of so many Americans that everything is falling apart is in fact an intuition we ought to pay a lot more attention to. This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work. Thank you for your attention.